All right, so get ready, because today we're going deep, really deep, into the story behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, a film that still has that power to just get under your skin.
Totally. And then we'll look at Ed Gein, the real-life inspiration for Leatherface.
Someone whose crimes, as horrific as they were, became like a cultural touchstone for horror.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And how did that happen? That's what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating journey into the dark side of America. Both the real and the imagined.
For sure.
Right.
Let's start with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre itself. The film that kind of threw the slasher genre into overdrive.
Released back in '74, right?
Yeah, 1974.
Yeah.
Became a cult classic. Yeah.
And with a really raw and unsettling aesthetic.
Yeah. And all that achieved on a tiny budget.
What always gets me is how, despite having such limited resources, the filmmakers created, well, such a visceral and enduring nightmare.
For real. So how did they do it? What were some of the techniques they used?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to the way it was shot,
Like the look of the film itself.
Yeah. That grainy film stock, the use of natural lighting, and the documentary-style camera work all contribute to this sense of realism.
Like you're right there watching it happen.
Exactly. It blurs the lines between fiction and reality, so it's almost like you're a witness to these horrific events.
And that feeling of lurking danger you get from the film is just, well, amplified by the fact that it was inspired by the very real crimes of Ed Gein.
Oh, yeah. His case, with all those grotesque details, the grave robbing, the mutilation.
And the trophies he made from human remains.
Yeah, it tapped into something, like a deep-seated fear in people.
Like the fear of the other, right.
The outsider.
The person who disrupts our sense of order and normalcy.
It's like he ripped away this curtain and exposed the darkness beneath.
And to think that this was all going down in the 40s and 50s in small-town America.
A time when everyone was, supposed to be grappling with the aftermath of World War II.
A time when everyone believed in social conformity and the good in people. Yeah, like the inherent goodness of small-town life.
And then, boom, you have Gein, completely shattering that illusion of innocence.
And security, too. Like, he mirrored the anxieties of a nation trying to rebuild, trying to just forget the horrors.
In a way, yeah. And that's probably why his story became so potent for filmmakers.
Okay, so we know his story inspired the filmmakers, but what about Gein's case, specifically, inspired the character of Leatherface?
Well, it's not like a one-to-one connection, right? Gein never used a chainsaw.
Where's the link?
It's more about a shared interest, this fascination with the human form.
Like an urge to manipulate and control it.
Exactly. Think about it. Gein tried to create a woman's suit out of human skin.
And Leatherface, with those masks he made from his victims' faces.
Both of them. They both speak to this macabre desire to just reshape the human body, to fit their own twisted desires.
It was this deeper theme, the exploration of the dark side of human nature, that elevates both Gein's story and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre beyond simple shock value.
Yeah, they make us confront those uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about the world we live in.
Truths that we'd rather ignore or just bury deep down.
Right, and maybe that's why these stories continue to captivate and terrify us.
Because they remind us that good and evil, sanity and madness, it's all kind of a blurry line.
That's thinner than we like to believe, yeah.
That's a chilling thought, for sure.
But also incredibly fascinating, don't you think?
I totally agree. Okay, so we've talked about the fascination with the human form, but let's go a bit deeper into Gein's psychological background.
Yeah.
What could have led him to this level of depravity?
Well, his childhood definitely played a role.
Isolated environment, domineering mother.
Yeah, and she was very religious,
Constantly preaching about sin and the evils of the flesh, especially when it came to women.
And that definitely instilled in him this very warped view of women and sexuality.
No wonder he had such a distorted view of the world.
Of course, none of this excuses his actions, but it does help to understand his depravity, at least a little bit.
It's like this real-life horror story, almost too often to believe.
And the filmmakers behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they really captured that real-life horror.
And turned it into something cinematic.
Right. And you have to remember, the 70s was a time of immense social and political upheaval.
You had the Vietnam War, Watergate, rising crime rates.
There was this feeling that the world was just coming unhinged.
And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it captured that collective anxiety perfectly.
So Leatherface and his family, they become this symbol of societal breakdown.
Of the lurking chaos that was just below the surface of everyday life,
Absolutely. They represent that primal fear of the unknown, the fear of the
which
other.
was so strong during that time.
And what's really interesting is how the film's low-budget style, it actually enhances that feeling of unease.
Yeah, the grainy film, the shaky camera work, it makes it feel so real.
It's like a documentary almost.
Like it could happen anywhere to anyone.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so terrifying.
It's not some monster in a mask. It's like
Yeah.
a reflection of our own deepest fears.
Right. Our anxieties about the world.
Okay, but why are we so drawn to these stories in the first place?
That is the question, isn't it? I mean, is it just morbid curiosity, or is there something deeper at play?
Yeah, it's like we're trying to understand the darkest parts of ourselves through these stories.
Maybe it's a way of facing our fears, you know?
Safely through fiction.
Exactly, like a pressure valve for our psyches.
I like that.
And I think there's also an element of fascination there.
Like we're repulsed by these figures, Gein and Leatherface, but we can't look away.
Right. There's something about their darkness that just draws us in.
It's like staring into the abyss.
Trying to grasp the depths of human depravity. Yeah.
It brings us back to that question you asked earlier, about society's need to create and consume these horror stories.
What does it say about us, right?
What do you think?
It's a tough one, no easy answers. But I think these stories often reflect deeper societal anxieties.
Like we were saying about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released during such a turbulent time.
When everything felt like it was coming apart.
Right, and that's why Leatherface and his family became this symbol of chaos.
The chaos that was lurking beneath the surface of everyday life.
And that low-budget look of the film, the way it was shot, it just adds to that feeling.
Absolutely. The grainy film, the handheld camera work.
It's like watching a documentary.
You start to believe it could happen anywhere, to anyone.
Which makes it so much more terrifying.
Exactly. It's not just a monster in a mask. It's a reflection of our own fears.
And the fact that it was inspired by a real person, Ed Gein, that just makes it even creepier.
Yeah, it blurs the lines between fiction and reality in a way few films can.
So, back to the question, why are we drawn to these stories? What's the appeal?
I think it's a few things, honestly.
Like,
Well, there's the fascination with the macabre, that desire to see the darkest parts of humanity.
to explore the limits of what we consider acceptable.
But I also think it's a way to confront our own mortality, you know?
To face our fears through fiction.
Exactly, like a safe space to experience those emotions.
A kind of catharsis.
Yes, exactly.
And don't forget about the escapism factor.
Oh, absolutely. Horror movies let us step out of our everyday lives for a bit.
And experience something thrilling, dangerous.
All from the comfort of our couch.
A safe way to explore the taboo, the forbidden.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier that Gein's case inspired other horror villains, too, like Norman Bates and Buffalo Bill.
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some interesting parallels there.
What do you see as a connection between those characters?
Well, I think all three of them, they're all fascinated with transgression.
With breaking societal norms?
Yeah, and they all challenge our ideas of what's right and wrong.
And they all have these complicated backstories, don't they?
Right. You get glimpses into their past, the things that might have pushed them over the edge.
Like Norman Bates and his mother, Buffalo Bill and his gender dysphoria.
All of those things connect back to Gein's own messed up history.
It's amazing how one real-life figure could inspire so many different fictional characters.
It is, isn't it?
But it also makes you think about the line between inspiration and exploitation.
How should filmmakers handle such sensitive material, right?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
I think the key is respect, you know?
Respect for the victims, for the real-life events.
And a deep understanding of the complexity of it all.
It's not about sensationalizing the violence.
Right. It's about remembering that these are real people, not just characters in a story.
But at the same time, you have to acknowledge the impact these stories have on our culture.
How they make us think, question our assumptions about the world.
It's a balancing act, for sure.
Finding that balance between respecting the real-life horrors and using fiction to explore those bigger questions.
And sometimes I think horror can be a way to make us see the world differently.
Absolutely. When it's done well, it can be transformative.
And sometimes, let's be honest, it's just fun to be scared.
Oh yeah, there's a certain thrill to it.
It's like riding a roller coaster.
You know you're not in any real danger, but your body reacts as if you are.
It's a primal instinct.
And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it taps into those primal fears perfectly.
Those anxieties we all have about isolation, about being vulnerable.
And it does it in such a visceral way.
It really makes you think.
It does, doesn't it?
What do you think it says about us, about society, that a film like this became such a phenomenon?
Well, I think it speaks to our fascination with the taboo.
That urge to explore the limits of what's acceptable.
And maybe it reflects a deeper anxiety about the world, a fear that beneath the surface of normalcy.
There's this darkness we can't control,
Like the film is holding up a mirror to society.
showing us our own fears and anxieties.
Exactly. And that's why it continues to resonate with people even after all these years.
So we've covered a lot today, haven't we?
We have.
We've talked about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre
Gein, the cultural impact of his crimes.
and our own fascination with horror.
It's been quite a journey.
It has a journey into the dark heart of America.
Both real and imagined.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are your final thoughts?
I think it's important to remember that horror, at its best, is more than just cheap thrills.
It can make us think, challenge us, provoke us,
It can help us see the world in new ways.
and sometimes it's just pure fun.
Oh, of course, there's nothing wrong with enjoying a good scare.
But I think it's important to be mindful, to engage with these stories critically.
To think about what they mean, what they say about us.
I agree, horror can be so much more than just gore and jump scares.
Yeah, it can be really thought-provoking, you know?
And the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a great example of that.
Totally, especially considering how they pulled it off with such a small budget.
You've talked about the grainy film, the camera work,
Yeah.
but what else did they do to create that unsettling feel?
Well, the sound design is really effective.
How so?
They used a lot of diegetic sounds that are part of the film's world, like the chainsaw or the house creaking.
Oh, I see.
It makes it feel more real, you know, like you're right there.
Makes sense. And what about the music? Most horror films rely heavily on a score, right?
But the Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't have much music at all.
So when it does appear,
It's super jarring.
yeah, I can imagine that.
It keeps you on edge. You never know when something scary is going to happen.
And the acting, too, it's so intense.
Yeah, those actors, many of them were pretty unknown at the time.
But they all bring something really raw to their performances,
Especially Gunnar Hansen as Leatherface. He's terrifying.
even though he's wearing a mask for most of the film.
Right, but you can still feel the menace just from his movements, you know?
I've always wondered what it was like for the actors to film those chase scenes, especially with a real chainsaw.
Oh, yeah, didn't I mention that? Hansen used an actual chainsaw.
Wow, that's wild. That must have been so intense.
It really added to the fear, you know, for the other actors.
I can only imagine.
It's like the line between fiction and reality just disappeared.
Shows how dedicated they were to making a truly terrifying film.
It's like they wanted to create a nightmare, not just a movie.
And they succeeded. Big time.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, despite its low budget, became a cultural phenomenon.
It had such a huge impact on horror.
And it spawned all these sequels, remakes, even a video game.
Its influence is everywhere, even in more recent horror films.
It's amazing to think that one film could have such a lasting legacy.
And why do you think that is?
I think it goes back to those primal fears, the things that scare us on a deep level.
Isolation, vulnerability, the feeling that civilization is fragile.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre taps into all of that.
And it forces you to think, even while you're scared out of your wits.
It's a film that stays with you, makes you question things.
Well, we've explored a lot in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have. It's been fascinating.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Ed Gein, the psychology of horror.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface, though.
There's always more to uncover.
As we wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
I think it's important to remember that horror, when done right, can be a powerful tool.
Yeah, it's not just about cheap thrills.
It can challenge us, make us think, make us feel things.
And sometimes it can just be a fun way to explore the darker side of things.
Exactly. And with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a story that keeps giving, you know?
There's so much to unpack, so much to think about.
So I'll leave our listeners with this thought. What does it say about us, about society, that we create and consume these horror stories? Why are we so drawn to them? Is it escapism, a way to face our fears, or something else entirely? What are your thoughts? What resonates with you?
Yeah, there are no simple answers, and I think that's part of the appeal.
The exploration itself is what makes it so interesting.
It's not about finding all the answers.
It's about asking the right questions.
That's what a good deep dive does. It makes you think, it makes you curious.
And it leaves you wanting more.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep diving deep into the stories that shape our world.